Okay, so moving right along in Rudolf Steiner's book, The Spiritual Hierarchies and the Physical World, Zodiac, Planets, and Cosmos, to the third lecture, which is entitled Planetary Evolution, Saturn and Sun Stages of Evolution, and the Spirits of Personality. This is given the next day on April 13th in 1909 in the morning. And so now Steiner begins to enter into his creation myth, whereby he will divide the various incarnations of the earth into four distinct phases. And he says that, he starts off by saying that just as human beings have reincarnated, so too has the earth reincarnated. And its previous incarnation is that phase or stage of earthly evolution that I call moon, or old moon is better. And this isn't the current moon. Our current moon, he says, is only just a fragment left behind, a physical shell that's left behind from this planetary incarnation. He says old moon in turn was the reincarnation of a phase that I designate sun, or old sun, which also does not refer to our current sun. The people who misunderstand Steiner, and I've had individuals come to me and say this, the reason Steiner doesn't work is because he says that the sun differentiates from the earth, and that never happened. That's not what Steiner is saying. These are, Steiner is casting what is known in shamanism as X-ray vision. The shaman has, and there's a style of art that goes along with it called X-ray style art, where the shaman is able to peer into the insides of living things in order to diagnose them. He has to be able to see their astral and etheric bodies and peer into it, so that the physical body, which is opaque for others, is translucent for him. It's a little bit like the movie Altered States, where the main character, played by William Hurt, has to take a special type of mushroom or a special type of drug extracted therefrom in order to make his physical body diaphanous and translucent to his astral body, which is glowing and pulsing within him. Same thing here. Steiner has inherited the shamanic X-ray style from ancient shamanism, and he's casting it into our solar system backwards in time, as well as through the visionary state of it in space, to see the within of it. This isn't the without. This is the within. So these phases that he calls old moon and old sun are not our present moon and present sun, but states of being in the supersensible world. As things were happening on the supersensible plane that parallel the evolution on the physical plane, or that actually antecede it. I think in this case, all of this takes place before the actual densification of our physical sun, which burns hydrogen in order to emanate light in space, happened. And so we have the sun phase, the old sun phase, in turn was the reincarnation of a previous phase called Saturn. And he calls it Saturn. It's puzzling as to why he calls it Saturn. Elsewhere, he says that the reason is because it inhabited space as much as the degree of the orbit of Saturn does today. So it was that wide, as wide as Saturn. So that's why he calls it Saturn. Okay, so he says that, so what happened during old Saturn then is that there came a point where warmth began to permeate this space. Just as he has already talked about how the element of fire begins with warmth, and as warmth intensifies, it gradually begins to emanate light, eventually in the form of fire, which then begins to emanate smoke at a certain point. So too here now we can see why he has this model of densification of the elements as this proceeds, and it starts with warmth. And he says that the lower three hierarchies in his angelology, which is composed of angels, angeloi, which means messengers, they are the lowest, right above us, right above the human being, and above them are the archangels, or archangels, the angels of the Primal Beginnings. That's why they're called archangels or archangels, and above them are the archi, which means beginnings, of course. And these he translates into, he calls angels spirits of twilight, and he calls archangels spirits of fire, and he calls archi spirits of personality. But he says that the beings that are now angels today were human. They went through a human phase during the moon. On the moon incarnation, they went through a human phase, whereas the beings that we call archangels today went through their human phase during the sun phase, And the beings that we call Archi today went through their human phase during the Saturn phase, so that these human beings that now begin to come in are actually what now today have evolved upwards on the spiritual hierarchies into the level of today's Archi, Primal Beginnings. And that's indeed what these beings were, the Primal Beginnings. And how they formed was that if you could travel backwards in time and space, let's say, and you could see what this looked like, you wouldn't be able to see any light. There wasn't any light there, but you would be able to detect heat or warmth. It would be like, he says, like you were flying through an oven. And so you would be able to detect a warmth that at first, during the early part of Saturn, you would experience only within you as a kind of inner warmth, the way we experience an inner warmth in our bodies due to being warm-blooded animals, I presume. And whereas in the later phase, toward the end, the warmth would have been perceivable as something external coming toward you. But it went through this process where these beings, these Archi, these spirits of personality, which is what we refer to them as now, they were human then, are these bodies of warmth that he calls eggs of warmth. They're like these eggs of warmth that appear and sort of densify in space. And he doesn't mention this here, but an outline of esoteric science, which he was working on, he was writing it this same year in 1909, and it was published in 1910. He says that this corresponds to the physical body. These were the types of physical bodies that they had. They were just these eggs of warmth. And they originated, and they had this sort of breathing out and breathing in process, whereby when they breathed in, they took the warmth inside of them, and you wouldn't be able to perceive any of the external warmth. It would just be inside of them during their inhalation phase. But during their exhalation phase, then then they would exhale the warmth, and you would begin to perceive, you would be able to perceive, if you were there, the external warmth that occupied this space. And this breathing rhythm of inhalation and exhalation is key to understand, because it will later eventually become the alternation of our day and night cycles on our present incarnation, the Earth phase. And so this is what happened during the Saturn phase. The physical body forms, and it corresponds to the first of his physical bodies. The physical body, the etheric body, we have in common with minerals, a physical body. We have in common with plants, an etheric body. We have in common with animals, an astral body. And then we uniquely have an I, capital letter I, an ego, not the Jungian or Freudian ego, but that ego within us which enables us to think and form concepts and have a sense of identity, and which also transmigrates from lifetime to lifetime. So this is the process that would have been taking place, and this is all that would have taken place during the Saturn phase. Then there would have been a period which Steiner calls a pralaya. He borrows a lot of his terminology from India. A pralaya, or a darkening, in which everything would have darkened, not completely 100%, because if everything got sucked back up into the spiritual world, then the next phase, the sun phase, would not have been able to take place. But so then it moves into the sun phase, which forms the second half of this lecture, in which things get more complex. And he says that just as I talked about how fire works, where it starts with warmth, and then it produces light as it burns and gives off smoke, he says, now what happens is that we move into the light and smoke phase, so that the warmth or fire of Saturn, fire that doesn't exude light, now begins to densify into air. And so we begin to get a sort of gaseous envelope that also simultaneously lights up, just as warmth does when it achieves a certain temperature. It begins to glow and burn. And so now this lights up, just as our current sun is based on lighting up of gases at its interior, namely hydrogen at this point. Eventually it'll burn that into helium, and then burn that into carbon, and eventually down the line into all the elements, into iron and so forth. But this isn't our sun, as we'll see. This is a spiritual sun. This isn't the physical sun yet. So there would have been light, though, and this gas would have formed as it densifies, as the warmth densifies into air and light. And so we get what he means by old sun, or the spiritual sun that began to light up and take place. And it's almost as though he says that the warmth eggs begin to hatch, and the beings above today's angels, the archangels or archangels, primal beginnings, were human on this phase during the sun. So these are the human beings of this time, today's archangels, who have now, and the original angels the original archi from the first phase have now moved up the ladder to higher spiritual beings. And so it's almost as though he says these eggs hatch, and we begin to get these human beings that have bodies that are made up externally out of a gaseous sort of outer shell, but internally they radiate light. And so they pulse within this light, and the light becomes visible, that they radiate out into space as light. And they have these gaseous bodies. He doesn't say this, but elsewhere in esoteric science, he will say that this is also the period now of the formation of the etheric body. The physical body was formed out of these warmth eggs on Saturn. Now we begin to get the formation, as these eggs hatch into these beings of gas and light, of the etheric body, which corresponds to plants. Plants have etheric bodies. They have mineral bodies and etheric bodies, but not astral bodies. So too, these beings would have etheric bodies, and the etheric bodies, their consciousness would have been a kind of deep, dreamless sleep, plant-like consciousness. Plants have a dreamless sleep type consciousness, whereas the consciousness in the first phase would have been more like a mineralogical consciousness. Minerals don't even have a type of consciousness. It's just the only kind of consciousness they have is their physical reactivity to the application of fire to them, or the sedimentation as water washes over them. That's the only type of consciousness they have. It's reactive. So this consciousness would have been analogous to that of a deep, dreamless slumber, a plant-like consciousness. And these beings now, the exhalation-inhalation process that we saw originating with Saturn now begins to proceed in the following manner. As these beings exhale, they light up, and light streams out through the gaseous envelope around them, and it radiates out into space and pulses and glows as light. And then as they inhale, this light is pulled back within them, and it's dark. So it becomes dark again for a while. Then they exhale, and the light appears. And of course, this is the earliest archetype for what will later be the alternation of day and night. As we will see, as this process evolves over time, this will eventually turn into the day and night processes, which get considerably more complex during the next phase, which is the phase of old moon, the moon phase, when these planetary bodies begin to split off. The sun splits from the earth, and eventually the moon splits from the earth. But here, it's just a state and an age of pure gaseous, light-filled radiance that lights up space and these human beings who are what we refer to as today's archangels, that is, archangels, or angels of the primal beginning, were here. And then the whole thing then begins to darken once again, and it darkens into yet another pralaya. So there's another period of darkness. Each one of these 4 periods is marked by a pralaya, a punctuation of a pralaya, an epoch that would correspond, interestingly, that corresponds, now that I think about it, to our geological epochs. Each of our geological epochs, as we move, let's say, from the Hadean, which is the oldest, which is purely mineralogical, to the Archean, which is the next oldest, which about 2 billion or so years ago begins to have life. The first bacteria begin to appear. Thermal bacteria living in fermenting bacteria living in thermal vents down in the ocean floor begin to appear, and eventually cyanobacteria that invent photosynthesis and so forth. Life begins to appear during that second phase. Then it moves from the Archean to the Hadean, or from the Hadean to the Archean, and then eventually to the Proterozoic, in which these organisms begin to densify and nucleated cells begin to appear, the distinction between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And then eventually the Cambrian begins to appear with the first little tiny animals that can be held in the palm of the hand. Each one has different structural characteristics. And as it goes along, we begin to see that each one of these epochs is marked by its own pralaya, namely a catastrophe. This is the reason why we have separate geological epochs, because a catastrophe has punctuated and demarcated each of these epochs from the one after it. The catastrophes usually have to do with the eruption simultaneously of massive volcanoes around the planet. The Earth's crust was quite a bit more unstable and has become more and more stable over time. And maybe a few of them, obviously the dinosaurs with a meteorite that crashed on the Yucatan Peninsula. But each one of them, and especially the Permo-Triassic, which was the biggest one of all, where 98% of all life was wiped out at the end of the Permian period, which swept the stage clear for the coming of the dinosaurs during the Triassic period, was the result of massive volcanic eruptions. So each of our geological epochs, too, is demarcated from one another by a pralaya, by a major catastrophe. That's why we have them. And so too with Steiner's epochs here, he has them demarcated by the internal catastrophes, let's say, of these pralayas. So we'll leave it there as he moves into the next lecture and begins to discuss the structural characteristics of Old Moon.